Hello, my name's Carly Winkler and I'm the Deputy Director of ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre. I'm here today with the Women in Defence and Security Network as part of our series to interview women about their experiences in the workforce and share some of their stories that help show different career paths and opportunities. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Sloan, who is the Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand with Palo Alto Networks. Sarah, it's great to actually see you in person again after all this time online.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. It's great to be with you in person rather than over a Zoom call.
Exactly.
It's phenomenal.
This world has become.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you've worked extensively in policy roles across government and now in the cybersecurity sector. How is that experience different? And how did your experience working in government help prepare you for that?
Yeah, so I actually am surprised by how they aren't that different, in all honesty. I think, government has its own processes and procedures. The private sector is much the same. And particularly in the cybersecurity and technology space, our mission or mandate is very similar. We are obviously, determined to secure the networks and protect our customer base. But we also work so closely with government agencies around the world in supporting their understanding of the threat landscape and the picture. So the mission is actually not too different, and that is what I found quite surprising. I had expected there to be a bit more of a difference than there is. As for how my role prepared me, my years in government prepared me for my role now in the private sector. So my role is really around, supporting government with the creation of policy and legislation regulations that touch on cybersecurity and technology issues. So having an understanding of how government develops policies, by virtue of being in government developing policies and legislation, really helped me to understand how to navigate the system from the outside. So, at what point in time do I need to engage? What is the general tone of things like submissions, who to talk to, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So having that background is immensely helpful in my role at the moment.
So in the cybersecurity sector and your view from there, what do you think are the most pressing cyber issues that the Australian government needs to deal with?
It's a big question. And I think, the first thing to say is that the government actually has done a lot in this space. And I think there's a lot that's going very well. We've obviously got a domestic cybersecurity strategy as well as an international strategy, which deals with things like critical technologies. That said, I think there is more, that we could do to expand on some of the themes and initiatives articulated in both of those documents, particularly with a focus on defence. Mm-hmm. And making sure that we have good cyber defences and resiliency across the whole of our economy. Mm-hmm. I know sometimes it's appealing to talk about offensive cyber capabilities, and they are very important. But at the same time, if you don't have your defensive posture right, then your offensive capabilities may or may not be that great or handy in a particular moment of conflict or a moment where we're seeing particular cyber activity. So I guess with that in mind, I think government, the government level needs to think about how it's securing its own systems and networks, particularly of those smaller agencies that may lack the resources and capabilities to, defend their own systems and networks. But equally, thinking about the levers that government has that it can pull to create that uplift across the economy. So one example here is, the government is responsible for granting things like spectrum allocation to private entities. And as part of that process in Singapore, they ask the private enterprise to justify how they're going to build that system and, to be secure and resilient by default. Mm-hmm. And we could look to implement simpler measures to that, whether it's in our spectrum allocation policies or whether it's in our procurement policies, asking key questions about supply chain practices. How do you secure the supply chain of your software development? Where is your hardware manufactured? Who have you shared your source code with? Because source code is the keys to the kingdom, and that's particularly important to understand. So there are various things that could be strengthened there. Some of these things, obviously, government's well and truly tracking and doing that. And more broadly, across the economy, we've seen the government pass critical infrastructure reforms, and we see those being particularly important. And in particular, the risk management plans, which will achieve, uplift across the economy as they force boards and all these big energy healthcare providers to think about cybersecurity risks, supply chain risks, and what they mean for their business. But we also need to obviously focus on small to medium enterprises and mums and dads. We as a sector have talked for some years about a slip, slop, slap campaign of cyber. And doing something like that, particularly in partnership with industry, could be very powerful, where we could co-brand it and get it out through our networks and really support the government in driving that message. I know there's been some great work there before, but just kind of re-energising some of those campaigns. And then the final point, I know that I could talk for hours about this, but the final point there would be looking at ways that we can create security by default, because your SMEs, they're busy, it's not their primary job to focus on cybersecurity. So how can we create systems and networks that are secure by default, where they don't necessarily have to think about these things?
And that's so critical for all the people who don't necessarily have the money or the technical skills to be able to do themselves. We still owe them protection, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, we're facing a competition in terms of resources, particularly talented, cybersecurity professionals are high in demand. So it's quite unreasonable to think that a small business is going to be able to necessarily get access to these individuals who have that skill set, because they're going to be sucked up by government or large corporations.
So you talk about a good point there with cybersecurity skills and getting into the industry. What fueled your interest in cybersecurity? And that's a really hard gap to fill, like bridging tech and security and government. I mean, how did you get there, and how did you decide that was something that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, so I think, like many people in our industry, I feel like I fell into cybersecurity or cybercrime at the time. So my background is actually, I did Asian studies and law, and I landed a job at the Attorney General's Department back in the day in the human trafficking section, because I did my honours paper in human trafficking and people smuggling, was very interested, was very delighted when I got the role. It was phenomenal, and really enjoyed my time working there. But then my big boss asked me if I would work in her cybercrime area. I didn't really know much about it, seemed kind of interesting, so I gave it a go and I loved it. The kind of work that you get to do in this space is phenomenal. I mean, it's one of the things is, as you know, right, it's constantly evolving, it's changing, the technology is changing, but also the threat landscape is changing, so you never really can be on top of everything, which, if you like to learn, is really an excellent field to be in. But there are some really significant legislative and policy challenges, right? Things that we have never really thought about that we're going to have to think about more and more. We talk about AI and machine learning, and we're entering an era where they're going to be able to make decisions for us, and decisions in particularly contentious kind of domains. And we're going to need to develop policies and legislation to look at how those decisions are made and how we ensure our values are reflected into those decisions. Equally, we've got the creation of critical technologies and companies coming through the ranks in Australia and globally who have these technologies that are going to be key to our future. What is the role of government in dealing with those organisations? If they want to go sell their particular product overseas, can government provide an alternative for them? What's the role in supporting that particular company to grow, but grow in a way that still aligns or still reflects Australian values and is supportive of our strategic interests?
Well, and I mean, there's never been a better time to get into cybersecurity than right now.
No, 100%. It's a very interesting space to be in.
So, do you have any suggestions on how best you can kind of communicate these topics? 'Cause obviously, you do a lot of this for a living.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's really challenging. I think part of it might come down to the fact that I studied Japanese, and part of this job is translation. It is about taking one language and putting it into someone else's language. And, I'm not going to lie, sometimes I've spent hours with poor technical people in the team just being like, but I'm sorry, can you explain that to me? But I figure, I'm not technical by background, so once I understand it, hopefully most people who are also non-technical can understand it too. But yeah, I think dialing it all down to simplified, kind of language. There's a lot of analogies that get thrown around in cyber. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But definitely approaching it in the, kind of a dialogue, getting to the core of what they're trying to say and going from there.
What do you see as any barriers to women getting involved in STEM and national security, defence kinds of roles? And how has your experience been?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that. I was at an event maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and I was talking to a young girl who was about 15, and both her parents worked in IT and cybersecurity. So I said to her, like, oh, do you want to do something similar to what your parents do? You want to kind of work in cybersecurity? And she said flat out no, because she basically said, oh, I don't want to work in front of a computer all day. So I thought that was really interesting, but really highlights the image problem that I think particularly cyber has, in that, even the media is guilty of putting out, hooded people on keyboards. But the true industry, the true reflection of the industry is actually there are a whole bunch of really diverse roles, very interesting roles out there. I mean, my role, as I said, is not technical. It's, policy, working on policy legislation, those kind of things. Equally, there's important need for marketing, people who understand how to, develop messages for broader consumption about technology. So there are a range of really interesting roles out there. So I think that's a barrier for women coming into, rightly or wrongly, coming into the industry, is the perception of the industry. Yes, it is quite a heavily male-dominated industry, but I think equally, there's a lot of will and a lot of people working to attract more women to the sector, and a lot of really good work that's happening there. Much like I'm sure other individuals, I've encountered some challenges in my time. Things like gender deafness and being asked to get coffees when I'm actually someone who's attending the meeting, not the person who's getting the coffee. And you sometimes wonder, is that just because I'm, maybe a youngish female, not too young anymore, but a youngish female in the room. So there's been challenges, but there's so much goodwill out there at the moment. I've had, phenomenal people, both men and women, who've been incredibly supportive of my career, and I'm very thankful to them for that. And I think there's a role for everyone in breaking the bias of, our own assumptions. Both men and women make these assumptions. So looking at how we can support each other in the workplace, calling out, when someone's had a really great idea and then, it hasn't really been heard, making sure that they can feel heard in those rooms. Looking at events and, roundtables and things that you're putting together and saying, well, do we have the right balance here? Is there a woman who might not have put her hand forward because she's too shy or she doesn't feel comfortable, and really trying to encourage them to do these things. So there's I think a couple of things that we can work on, but overall I feel quite positive about the direction that the industry is going in. I know there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of support out there for women in our industry. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right, and your ideas are exactly right. There's so much that we could all do, so thank you for that. We're almost out of time, but we have time for one last question. You reading or listening to anything interesting at the moment?
I am. I routinely listen to audiobooks. I love audiobooks. And at the moment, I'm actually reading The Fifth Domain, which I will tell anyone and everyone to read. It's a phenomenal read, particularly if you're looking at going into the sector, cybersecurity sector that is, or even if you're in the sector. A really good book, talk about translation, that translates very sometimes technical, like quantum computing, into language that you can understand and digest. So a really good book. The other book I just finished, which I'd also highly recommend, is called Red Notice. It's a book about how the Malinsky sanctions, which are sanctions against an individual, in layman's terms, were created, and kind of goes through the history of how they came to be, and it's well worth a read if that's kind of your area of interest.
Sounds interesting. All right, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been great to talk to you today.
No worries, thank you.